Debra, and we're very excited to have a panel discussion around Bill's beautiful work and this show that has come together in the last few years. And the Brooklyn Rail is co-hosting. Thank you guys so much. Great supporters of Bill's practice, and this is an amazing opportunity for us to come together around Bill. I was going to introduce the panel. So Choghakate Kazarian is a curator and an art historian. She just moved to New York from Paris, so we welcome her. Phong, he's co-founder of the Brooklyn Rail, and many of you know him. Also an amazing artist, writer, curator, and one of our panelists. Raphael Rubinstein is a critic and poet based in New York, and professor of critical studies at U of H, Houston, where I'm from.
Go Cougars.
Yeah, exactly, go Cougars. Debra Balken, an independent curator and writer who works on subjects relating to American modernism and contemporary art. So, welcome all of you, and let's get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eli, for this introduction, and welcome everybody to this beautiful show. These works look so amazing in that specific space, and really made me think a lot about many years ago when I've met with Bill for the first time. So I was in the process of moving from Paris to New York, and I was visiting the artist Chris Martin's studio in Brooklyn, and we spent hours and hours looking at his own paintings, discussing about so many different things. And at the end of the afternoon, he said, "You know what? You should definitely meet with Bill Jensen. You have so much in common. Both of you adore Albert Pinkham Ryder and Tarkovsky's movies." So he made a quick call to Bill and just brought me to his studio. So this long afternoon turned into a long evening, and it was just a magical encounter. I don't know if some of you had the chance to go to his studio, but it feels like an Italian villa in the middle of Brooklyn. And himself feels like a sort of old maestro who really appeared out of a Tarkovsky movie. He really makes me think about the movie Nostalgia, the character of the poet. So it was quite a magical moment for me. And so my first question will be to know a little bit how each of you met with Bill, either in person or with his work, and how this encounter was.
Debra?
Okay. Well, I first encountered Bill's work, I guess, in the early 1990s. I lived in New York, in Soho, and I began to follow his exhibitions at Mary Boone Gallery with great admiration. And finally, about 8 or 9 years later, I met Bill for the first time in Maine at a residency program called the Acadia Summer Arts Program. We affectionately refer to it as Camp Kippy. And I met Bill and Margaret there, and I had just organized an exhibition, a retrospective exhibition on the work of Arthur Dove that Bill had seen here in New York at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And we embarked on a conversation about the ties between his work in the early 20th century, and subsequently over the years have enjoyed many conversations with him at his wonderful villa, as you put it, in Brooklyn.
So I guess I first began looking at Bill's work in the mid-late 80s as I was starting off as an art critic. But I think for me, like, where I really started to get a deeper sense of his work was I organized a show in 2013 at Chime & Reed Gallery called Reinventing Abstraction. And it was looking at a generation of New York painters born between 1939 and 1949 who starting in the late 70s, early 80s, really began to, like, you know, coming out of the 70s where painting was in, you know, once it had died one of its many deaths. And there were all these painters who had, you know, blithely ignored that, and Bill was certainly one of them. And one of the things that, like, we take it for granted now, but that his paintings had, like, a figure-ground relationship. And, you know, returning to the figure ground, or returning to the stretched canvas, or oil paint, all of that sense of, and particularly with Bill, like the sense of history, both, like, as Debra was saying, like, you know, American eccentrics like Dove and Hartley and Ryder, but also, you know, he was really, I guess one of the things that inspired my show was the painter David Reed saying that there's a street history of painting that in New York that only when painters run into each other on the street and they talk about the, you know, what they see as the history of painting, it's not the official history, it's not the museum history, and I think that that's, you know, Bill's work is exemplary of that for me.
How about you, Phong? I don't know when and how you met Bill. You've known him for a while.
Yes, probably in the late 80s. But I think the show that I first saw of Bill was at the Film Academy when he had the small survey in 1987. And so that was a while ago. I was barely a kid, just moved to New York, deciding whether I'm going to pursue my art director profession, which I was trained for, to be working for Condé Nast, or to be a bohemian and maybe try out with painting. And I think the encounter with that show made a tremendous impression because it was the same year that I began reading Melville Moby Dick. And I think that coincided with also, I was also understanding more about Pollock. You know, it was a brand new discovery in that Pollock, as you remember when he was asked among the American master, who you most admire, he said Albert Pinkham Ryder. So then I discovered that Leo's greatest admiring painter was Ryder. So connecting Ryder to Melville to Pollock and then to Bill Jensen was so peculiar because Pollock painted the most monumental painting, and yet his aspiration is really achieve a certain intimacy, while Bill, who paint very intimate paintings, small-scale painting, yet have a sense of monumentality that it exudes. So I was very interested in that contradiction all at once. So it was rather overwhelming, but that's how I was exposed to the work. As Debra say also, he was beginning to show at Mary Boone, moving away from John Washburn uptown. So that was a very interesting predicament in a way, because he was shown with Ruin Schnabel and with Barbara Kruger, you know, and David Saleh, of all the big neo-expressionists of that period. But that's how it all began for me.
Speaking of older times and how the past comes back to now, I remember something a few years ago, it was 5 or 6 years ago I think, when Bill, at some point, he rediscovered one of his older works from the mid-70s called Redon, as the French painter's name was Didon Redon. And he hadn't seen that, it's a very small painting like this, you know, sort of spiraling form on it, and he hadn't seen that painting for decades. And when he rediscovered it, he had an epiphany. I remember he was so excited, and he said, you know, it took my breath away. I couldn't believe I made something so beautiful. Which is quite exciting, because Bill is not the kind of artist who say, I'm a genius, I'm great. You know, there's a lot of doubt, uncertainty in his work, but rediscovering his older work was really an epiphany, and that work somehow nourished other works he was working on, and that spiraling form gave birth to the yin-yang that you can see in so many of the paintings in that show. And because he thought that this is a sort of mandala and the yin-yang, so it was really much a sort of connectedness between these forms and circles that come really as a sort of stamp on these floating words. So maybe, Raphael, you would like to see something about the circles in these words.
Okay. Well, just if you look at them, they seem to be the last thing that's painted on each canvas. The mandalas are the last. And and the thing about Bill's work is that the painting, each painting is a record of its own making and unmaking. And just as you look closely, all of these, thousands of scratches on the surface and the history and the palimpsests of everything. But I think what you said is like a stamp. It's almost like a signature. And the painting is done, and I think he's the kind of painter who, who knows when, like, he doesn't know when the painting is going to be finished, and maybe it's something you can always return back to. But I think that was one thing that struck me. And also thinking about the yin yang, and that it's has a double yin yang.
Yeah.
And I think that as you said, Bill has been is so influenced by Chinese painting, and one of the things I'm by no means an expert, I know very little about Chinese painting, but there is the idea of emptiness is really important, and I think that with the binary of the yin yang, the third element is the emptiness, and that kind of breaks down or complicates the binary relationship. And I think that that's something interesting. And also, but these bands, the color bands, particularly in this painting, what's the title for it?
Flowing vastness, isn't that the title?
Flowing vastness. The vastness of these, like, so if this is a circle, where is the rest of the circle? It implies such a, and Phong said, and it's really important, the intimate scale of Bill's work. That, in fact, was a radical thing he did. I think in the late 70s, he'd been making larger scale, and I think he's had to stop grinding paint because of health issues, and he started working much smaller. But I think working smaller is also almost a political statement. And also reconnecting with that history of, he talks about how his moment, his like Damascene moment was at the Brooklyn Museum, where he was a young Midwesterner who had just arrived in New York City, and he sees these 5 Albert Pinkham Ryder paintings, and that, like, what's interesting is, like, it's not like seeing de Kooning or Pollock or Rothko, it's Ryder that sets him off on his journey, and I think that's one of the things that accounts for Bill's originality and uniqueness as a painter.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, at that very moment you just described, is when the early 20th century American modernists are being re-excavated, rethought, and revived through a number of exhibitions, primarily here in New York, at the Whitney during the decade of the 1970s. And all of these figures are also working on the same intimate scale. They remain easel painters, unlike the abstract expressionists who will supersede them.
And also it had deeper roots. He went to University of Minnesota, both undergrad and graduate school there, where he had a teacher named Peter Buser, one of the second generation of the New York school, who would invite New York artists to come, Tony Smith, Ron Rothschild, Michael Goldberg. So Bill was exposed to New York painting to some extent, but he also took a Chinese art history class with a professor named Robert Poor, P-O-O-R. And I think he was completely taken by Chinese painting, Chinese poetry, philosophy from the very beginning. So the epiphany began there quite early on. It took a while for him to come back, but I wanted to stress something to me, it's quite essential. because as Raphael pointed out, that intimate scale during the 80s, which were, I would say, superstar, social, media friendly, like Schnabel. Actually, you can even say, I don't remember what year, must have been in the early 90s or late 90s when Roberta Smith reviewed New York Times, when she compared him the most un-Schnabel-like painter. And yet, and they share something very similar, is that they are creating their own mythology. And they very often give pretentious title. And I'm not so sure I agree with Roberta on this, because I just spent quite a bit of time at the MoMA just a week ago and re-looking slowly at all the great working paintings, and they have marvelous titles. You know, Diary Seducer being one, Agony, and of course the great one I was not long ago at the Albright Knox, now it's called Buffalo Art Gallery, Liver is a Coxcomb. So the title for some painter is important, and it helps you to identify with the work. I mean, good luck if you can find Rothko or let's say Bob Ryman title. You would never be able to identify any of them. So that's one thing about Bill being anchor in that period in the 80s. It's interesting.
It is. And just about the titles, I think one thing that makes, there are many things that make Bill a distinctive painter, but is that he works in series. And like, if you look at the paintings, like the variety of different kinds of paintings just within this room is really striking. And some of them, but they're all, you know, it's not because he changes over time. He does change over time, but he's always working on simultaneously on different series. And I think that the titles also like kind of carve out a conceptual space for him to, like, how he's able to shift from one mode to another mode to another mode. And I think, you know, I think that's also one of the reasons that Bill's work has not gotten the kind of institutional interest and attention that it deserves. And he's, I think, you know, his paintings are recognizable, but they are recognizable in different ways every time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what you said about myth, about so that Bill and Schnabel, and they're creating their own myths, but there's a lot of layers of things going on in the paintings, but I feel like one doesn't have to know that. Like, you don't have to know, like there's a painting in the next room, which is an older painting that has this motif that Bill uses over and over again, which is a painting by Andrei Rublev of these, the Holy Trinity. And it's this, Bill had drawn the shape, the outline shape of this group in this 15th century Russian icon. And you know, it's interesting to know that, but it's like you don't have to know that to get the painting, I think. And I haven't spoken with Bill about that, but I'd be interested. Like, he doesn't, you know, you don't have to read the press release. These are very experiential works.
Well, that's another thing that they both share, Schnabel and Bill. They're good friends, actually. They have mutual interest in cinema. Their mutual admiration for Andrei Tarkovsky is known. They also admirers of Jean Vigo and a lot of neo-realist Italian and French films. But Rublev remained to be an everyday viewing experience. In fact, when I came to, every time I pay a visit to Bill's studio, the film is being played throughout the day. And it's very important to somehow relate to Tarkovsky. As you remember, in 87, 88, before he died, he wrote this incredible long meditation of his practice. It's called Sculpting in Time. And I think it's very important to put in the context of poetry, philosophical and religious, or let's say spiritual leaning, because there's a lot of reference in throughout the film. I don't want to be specific, but any kind of episode, segment of a certain protagonist, whether Andre reflects himself, whether the bell maker, Boris, whether the so-called children of the God, the mad young woman who really serve as a symbol throughout of endurance, of innocence and vulnerability. And I think that's the point where she entered into the church after the raid of the Tartar. She was under stress, and she took her hand into a bucket of paint and smeared it on the wall. And I think that passage seems to be sustaining and repeated in a lot of Bill's work. But I don't want to get distracted here, because you mentioned about the Chinese yin and
I
yang.
just have to say something about the film, though. I mean, the film is constantly on in his studio, but it's out of sight.
Yeah.
All he will hear are the voices, and he claims that he wants the voice of genius, in his studio as he's contemplating the next step or move in his painting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
It's very interesting.
And the voices are in Russian.
Yes, but he knows the script well enough that he can replay them. in his
Yeah.
mind.
But it's interesting to think about how can you be inspired by filmic sequences,
Yeah.
or even the voices, the dialogue,
Right.
and able to extrapolate and with the hope that you can make a believable painted image.
Right.
I think that's, to me, is interesting, the same way that he would do with the symbol yin and yang, or a certain segment of Michelangelo in The Last Judgment, for example, which we will talk later. But I think the perpetual interest in Chinese philosophy, poetry, is very deep, and it all maybe relate to his roots of his upbringing in Minnesota. I don't know, but I know that Minnesota was one of the earliest wave of immigrants coming from Sweden, which is different right below Wisconsin, where the German would migrated there. It's interesting how different early second and third wave of immigration, the Swedes made their home there in Minnesota, which to me that is very close to the Russian sensibility. But I don't know why there's such perpetual, deep, profound interest. But all I know, if you were to put Bill Jensen into traditional American dogma romanticism, as you know, you wrote so eloquently well, Arthur Below and Modest Hartley, then he had that amazing continuum in that painting culture that compressed very intimate scale painting, and also it's extremely dark, because let's face it, let's say, if you remember reading Melville, Moby Dick in chapter 3, when Ishmael went into the Spouter Inn in New Bedford, Massachusetts, he remembered the painting, a seascape painting that was very vague, extremely dark, almost like
Like a rider.
very much so. And more interestingly, the whole entire bar, the bartender was named Jonah, and all the spear and the harpoon was being displaced around it, almost as if it is the inside of the whale jar, and you get Jonah in it. I mean, there's so much references to the book itself. But the book itself to me is so interesting to think of where Ryder was born in 74? Maybe it was the same year that Melville Moby Dick was published. So something of that conduit of intuition was very strong, and I think it's so American to me. I mean, I don't know anything about American culture until I started to learn more and more, looking through Ryder, looking to Pollock. I don't know, I mean, I'm sure most of you probably have read Clement Greenberg, the American type painting. Remember? He called the American chiaroscura. To me, that is so significant. But I don't want to be distracted and talk way too much. Let's get back to Choghakate. And I continue.
I just want to pick up on one thing you said about time. This, I haven't read it, but Sculpting in Time, Tarkovsky's text. And I think that, just to go back again to Andrei Rublev, and I was reading about the history of that icon, and it had been not like they called it a renewal, like over the centuries, it was continually like painted over and painted over and painted over, and finally in the early 20th century they began to try to strip away. They stripped away most of the additional later painting and brought it back to its original state. And there is, I think, this relationship of time in Bill's work, because it's that, as I said, like it's the history. The painting shows you the history of its own making. And Bill somewhere, I think he says this, like the paintings are like compressed time, and that. So I think that's something that that marks him out, even though he's a New York painter, but also the relationship to nature, as you said, like that Midwestern, Northern, these are Northern paintings in a way, even the ones that have the bright color, there's something, I think, almost melancholy about them.
Well,
It's interesting, he doesn't really begin to contend with it, nature, though, until he moves to the Northeast. And he's always maintained that nature was daunting and frightening to him growing up as a child in Minnesota, that it elicited too many childhood traumas. And it was actually during a residency in Choghakate in Maine, and contending with the very dense primordial landscape of that area of the country, where he had an epiphany and a reckoning. And I think that epiphany and reckoning is really interesting as it relates to a figure like Arthur Dove. And I'll just recount a very brief story. Arthur Dove, like Hartley and Marin and Alfred Maurer and other figures, did spend time in France. Dove had introductions to the Circle of Gertrude Stein, which he didn't act on. Instead, he painted primarily in Brittany in the south of France, produced these very generic plein air paintings that were quite retro, comes back to the United States and establishes a relationship with Alfred Stieglitz, and that relationship initially centered on defining the authenticity of American art. How is American art differentiated from Europe? Dove goes back to Geneva, New York, where he grew up, and he spends a couple of months actually in the woods examining butterfly wings and the chromatic features of bark, and he begins to talk about painting as aspiring to a condition of light. And that is exactly the kind of epiphany that Bill has in Choghakate in 1986.
Fascinating, and he certainly was considered American first abstract painter.
Yes.
Arthur Biddle.
Yes, the first abstract painter in this country.
Yeah. How would you describe Maurice Hartley, who's a bit younger slightly?
Well, no, Hartley and Dove are at the same age, and he dies a little earlier than Dove, 3 years earlier than Dove. But Dove is its work can be described by continuity. Hartley cannot. There are distinct episodes in Hartley's career, and he never truly gives up on the figure. There may be a few instances where he will paint in Mexico or in the Southwest, where the work does become abstract, but it never aspires to the kind of abstraction of Dove.
And because, so what is interesting in what you say is that, so Bill Jensen has this epiphany of Albert Pinkham right in the early 70s at the Brooklyn Museum, He said that he was struck by lightning. He felt a presence in the room. And he's also interested in Hartley, Dove, abstract expressionism, and Ronald Bladen, also whom he met in the early 70s and worked for him, and they stayed friends. So would you say there's sort of thread of romanticism in American art that to which Bill belongs? So I know Phong spoke of so dark romanticism. So how would you place him in this history of American art? What are, because there's a connection with, I mean, sometimes direct connection. I mean, Hartley knew Ryder, he followed him, wrote about him. What connects these artists, according to you?
Me? What connects these
I mean,
artists?
it's not the Andy Warhol connection, it's a
No.
different thread.
Well, I can tell you, when I work on modernist figures like Dove or Hartley or O'Keeffe, not that O'Keeffe has any bearing on Bill's work, but you know, I constantly think about their relevance in terms of this moment in time. I mean, what endows their work with a kind of currency? And I think it's by looking at a figure like Bill Jensen, who is assigned such importance to, you know, this historic moment. I mean, you can only bring these figures back if there is some interest, I think, on the part of contemporary artists in these figures.
And I think also it's the influence is definitely there, and there's so much to say about the influence. But again, I don't think it's like you can approach Bill's paintings without being weighed down or having to take into consideration the art historical background and his influences and references. I think that Bill talks about, he says that the content of his paintings is emotion. It's the emotional event of making the painting is the content of the painting. So we don't, you know, that, maybe that's incredibly romantic. Maybe that's American romanticism right there.
Yeah,
like
I mean,
the idea that,
emotions
like,
in general.
it's like a, you know, tabula rasa. They're like, you know, it's someone, it's the figure, the isolated figure, whether it's, you know, from Melville or from Pollock, or who is trying to, you know, make some sort of sense and have a place within this unknown territory.
And there's also his emphasis on epiphany. He always says that every time he has had many epiphanies in museums and seeing artworks, and he wants to create that. And there's so much emotions, and that's why also he says that, you know, I've asked him many times why he takes so much time, years, and there, as you said, there are layers. So it's compare that to the idea of seepage, and he says because there's so many emotions that needs to unfold within the painting, and also because he positions the role of the artist somehow in a sort of falsely passive mode. He says he always, I mean, Debra said also because, you know, he's in the studio, he can only hear Andrei Rublev downstairs. And he also says to me, like, basically what he does when he enters the studio is just sit in a chair. And that's what he says, like, basically most of his time as an artist consists of sitting in a chair and letting emotions unfold and see things on the work. And he says, like, when I've reached a certain state of boredom, I think that's good. This is where I connect with the artwork. And somehow it also connects with his idea of Chinese philosophy, something where the cosmos is something that is in constant transformation and it's not something definitive. So maybe, I don't know, how do you feel it connects with your idea of provisional contemporary art? Because you came up with that concept, which means different things, but how does it connect or opposes that idea?
Well, certainly, I mean, I think there's a real strong connection between Taoist philosophy and my ideas about provisionality. And as you said, like that, this sort of almost submissive waiting, which is, you know,
also shared by Tarkovsky. Tarkovsky has also sort of similar vision of creation.
So I think that sense of the passivity is part of it, but I think also that the Bill is, you know, the way he constantly destroys paintings. He makes the painting and destroys it, and makes it and destroys it over and over and over again. And So that each, that, and by leaving the traces of that, there is this, maybe that embodies some kind of sense of the provisionality of any one moment. And I think also, again, like that sense of the fragility and of the kind of the human being within nature, which again is Taoist, really, that it's not about being victorious and conquering. This is more about being able to rescue, salvage some kind of, as you use Bill's term, seepage, like what is kind of seeped through.
You mentioned the word emotion,
Yeah.
emotionality or emotional content. It's when I look at Bill's painting, sometimes I almost feel watching a baseball game because both the emotions are visible, very tense, all the player, but it's also extremely slow. It's what James T. Farrell, one of my favorite writers, the author of Stuck Lonigan, also wrote a wonderful enduring admiration and lifelong admiration and love for baseball. It's called My Baseball Diary. And he spoke about baseball as American pastime, the opposite of, let's say, football, which is the American invention equivalent of the Roman gladiator. It's super violent, fast,
It's also it's time. I think that
very time.
Baseball it runs on 19th century time.
That's right.
And it's just, this is changing with the way they're changing. Pitchers have not enough time to, that, which to me sort of undercuts the whole beauty of baseball and the fact that it's survived in 19th century time. And maybe this is too much of a stretch, but this kind of painting too, painting is this survival, it's, as someone said, maybe it was Leo Steinberg, this is, he's talking about Jasper Johns in the 60s, it's one of the last handmade things in our society, and now even more so. So that, I think time is really, really important there. And, and I think like everyone here, when we are finished, these are paintings that really do reward long.
But I wouldn't want to be
6.5
dismissive of the whole idea of slowness versus speed.
Mm.
I know Bill doesn't quite invested in pop art and other artists that we might admire, but I wouldn't easily dismiss people like Warhol, who made silk green painting. And I know that in its retrospective at MoMA 1989, I remember reading a review by John Updike in the New Republic, and it's called Fast Art for Busy Manhattanite. And it was beautifully written, like saying where you cannot argue about Bill Kramer either. You might not agree with their view, their perspective on the artist's work, but basically I asked him, as I ran into him on the street, through George Braziller, and I said, but did you spend time watching his film? He said, no. Well, I say, it's super long, sir. Sleep is 6.5 hours. So you have to put that in context. Without the film, lengthy of encapsulation of time, Warhol would not be considered a legitimate artist. So the mediation between fast and slowness is completely divided in his work, but it's always part of his pictorial synthesis. Bill is utterly invested in slowness of painting. Very slow. I think that slowness had a lot to do with contemplation through the Taoist. Prolonged Chinese philosophy is all about that also, because the word Chan, which is later when it Buddhism reaches to Japan, it became Yen. So Zen Buddhism is different than Chan in Buddhism in China. In the Buddhist tradition in China, if you go up to the mountaintop, you can walk miles and miles and no one's there. And you can absorb and spectacle the sublimity in nature. You go home and then you would make your painting. To copy nature is considered vulgar, inferior. But in Japan, if you go up the mountain, tons of people already there. So the meditation had to be within, internalized. Different, I think that's why Bill is more of a Chinese Zen, Chan tradition than it is Zen. But again, it's also very complex because you take that into the slowness of rider. You find that there's a very dark, deep, serious meditation of labor, the sense of labor. I think labor is something that we don't really talk so much nowadays because technologically it's been, resided over, and now it's been brought over China. I mean, at thinking about Putin, thinking about Trump, and thinking about Xi Jinping. I mean, that's already says so much about Trump's speed and his presidency, contemplation, and slowness. So I don't want to make it political, but it is definitely something that already exists deep in the DNA. And Bill had that deep interest in that tradition. It's so complex. You can talk for like an hour on this, just that subject alone. But I give it back to you.
Thank you. I mean, it's a good transition because before we turn to Q&A, I wanted to ask the last question because we brought up so many different topics and slowness and a sort of meditation and a sort of very complex sense of self as an artist, either as an active or passive agent. And in a sense, do you feel like his position as an artist and his position about art is a sort of figure of resistance towards the hysterical world we're living in? Or how can you position him in today's world and art scene in general?
For you, Raphael.
All right, so I'll take a shot at that. I think that Bill's relationship to contemporary painting is not, I wouldn't think about it in terms of style or technique. And the other day, Phong and I were talking about Bill's work, and you said, Phong used the term alchemist. And there's this, to quote Leo Steinberg again, there's this wonderful conversation. It's in his article from 1955 on Jackson Pollock's first retrospective, which was at Sydney Janus Gallery. And Steinberg says he's having a conversation with the painter Paul Brock. And Steinberg says that the person who becomes an artist changes from culture to culture and period to period. And that in so-called primitive societies and in the Middle Ages, the artist was someone whose role was to realize common myths of the society, common myths of the culture. And that someone who would have been an artist in the Middle Ages or in primitive society today, 1955, would be a filmmaker or work in advertising or write science fiction. And Paul Brock says, yes, and the person who becomes an artist today, 1955, in the Middle Ages would have been an alchemist. Mm-hmm. And then Steinberg says, yes, but who understood what the alchemists were doing? Only other alchemists. So I think in some ways that Bill is like a painter's painter. Mm-hmm. And I think that's that's a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
So,
what was the question again?
how he relates to the contemporary scene.
Well, think that it has a lot to do with being hermetic, being reclusive, a little kind of the seclusion of the self. I remember must have been in 2006, in my interview with Barbara Novak, the great Americanist, in her third book, it's called Voyage of the Self, which is a terrific book. I don't know if you've read it. If you haven't, you go back to the Rail archive and type up Barbara Novak and my name will pop up. It's a fantastic book where she pairs how American literature can be in parallel with American painting. So let's say Jonathan Edward, pairing with the first American that was sent to be studied in Europe, John Singleton Copley. And it ended with Pollock and Charles Olson. But I believe in the 5th chapter, she spoke about Albert Bingham Ryder in parallel, in dialogue with Emily Dickinson. So that's something to be found in Bill, because in order to make this kind of work, you had to protect your hermetic, seclusive lifestyle. I mean, he often go to Chelsea, he go to New York, to Manhattan, to the museum to see whatever he's doing, only to snap right back to generate that hermetic practice in order to do the work that he made. So that, to me, that is very interesting because it has to do with intimacy of scale, as you say, provisional way of reapplying many process painting. Because in a way, he emerged he came to New York in 1971, I think. So that was a very interesting decade. I remember that in the whole decade of 70s, so that's basically predominant by minimalism. You can imagine painting, as Raphael say, was put in the back burner. So what was the condition of how painting can survive? By experimenting. I remember there was a great show that Katie Siegel did at the Academy of Art or Design.
High Time.
That's right. New York painting, 1966 to 1975. So everybody was taking canvas off the wall, creating different kind of structure, and even sometimes play on the floor. So we know that with Ron Warchop is a good example, create a three-dimensional structure, but still able to make painting. So in that context, Bill is far removed from the experimentation of those artists, you know. Another painter who's actually here, who worked with that traditional flatness, but with shape canvas, is our friend somewhere sitting in the back, Johanna Pusidar. So you can tell you more about it in that period too. But I think the 70s was very challenging for painting. And if you think that someone like older than Bill, you and I had talked about Guston. Guston suffered a great deal in 72. None for a good decade until he died in 1980. He produced vast amount of painting, but very few were purchased by museum or collector.
Until after his death.
Until his death. So that's a good testament of how enduring, difficult at that time. So that was the time that Bill reached his maturity. It's very interesting to me to think about his friend, mentor like Ronald Layden. So where is Ronald Layden in Bill Jensen's work? It's very discreet. No more, no less than, let's say, Guston in 67, 68 that stopped painting and decided to make drawing for 1 year. He hated minimalism, but he certainly adopted minimalist discipline by drawing 1 line, 2 line, gradually accumulate into 4, 5, and then became a singular object. The alphabet painting, you remember all. So I think Bill had a similar aspiration. It's just more subtle in his work. And that's why I go back and revisiting his roots from early interest in Chinese philosophy and poetry. It's really about reconciling or achieving the sense of present and absent simultaneously. I'm trying to do the same because I'm trying to understand the West, but I have to retain my indigenous Eastern roots. So it's interesting to understand Bill's work from my perspective as I'm trying to understand the West through his painting in the same way.
Debra, would you like to add something before?
I think we should take some questions.
And thank you so much for this interesting conversation. I'm sure you have many questions. Would like to start? Yes.
Just from where I'm sitting here looking at these several paintings, it looks like the surface is very flat as opposed to glossy. Like from here they look really exceptionally flat and matte. If I try to look into them, the addiction always stops right at this dry surface. I'm wondering if any of you could, if you feel the same way, if you could comment if you think that might be intentional, that there's no varnish or visible oil.
I think that if you look at Bill's paintings, maybe it's not so evident in this selection, but I think a lot of his paintings have incredible, like a big variety of different kinds of surfaces that matte and shiny and like that. I think that's one thing that has characterized a lot of his paintings. But maybe, no, as you say, maybe, no, but I think if you look at this one too,
He uses also this type of turpentine as a thinner to stain his paints while preserving the colors. So he layers very, very thin layers.
I see. So it's very different from Ryder, who used wax, I think he used candle wax, which makes a very different effect.
Well, that's exactly what Clement Greenberg called American chiaroscuro. In other words, unlike the European, painting, you have a very specific, legible procedure of how you make underpainting and you put glaze. Everything is very legible. The American, and also oil paint, the American chiaroscuro that he referred to is exactly what you described. When Ryder began using candle grease or animal fat, mixing oil paint to create that density, the light in Ryder is unlike any other, and that's a thing that Pollock picked up on. Pollock picked up on in 1946-7 when he began making not the early, oil painting that make reference of his homage and his admiration of Ryder. It's the drip painting actually when he began to apply enamel painting. Very unconventional too, just like what you described of Ryder. So the enamel paint is industrial paint, on raw canvas on the floor and whatnot. So Bill had worked as a mason. He always worked with hand labor. He built bridges when he was a kid, came to New York, he worked construction. So often if you look closely, you will find the multitude of ways in which the spatula was applied. And so it really had that dense, compact, compressed surface. It's not by the brush, but by the spatula, which is what Balken did when he was a house painter. By the time.
Bill said at one point he locked away all his brushes.
Yeah.
And just didn't let himself use a paintbrush for years.
So that's also very interesting. The sense of labor. It's very American. It's so American. It took me years and years to understand and appreciate that. It's like the way that Carl Andre dressed up like a workman suit, and make industrial use of steel. Same thing with Richard Serra, right? So it's a similar thing, but you see it more subtly when you look closely on the surface.
Okay, thank you.
I think it has also maybe to do with his interest in Chinese painting also. It's kind of very light materials.
Well, I think fresco too, like,
Yes.
you know, I
Yes.
think he's going for that, like,
Yeah. Which is another complexity too, which is something that Gorky and the Kunin has spent time, weekend to study the Pompey mural at the Met. They want that definitive, compact, compressed surface, almost like, I would say, porcelain. Script of the access, reveal no visibility with brushstroke. If you look at Gorky, early the Kunin, the painting of Gorky is him and his mother. It's a really great evidence of that. It's like a Vermeer surface. It's amazing. But you see that occasionally, not all, not in all. But I like that reference, it's super true.
Yes.
Hi. When I first became aware of this work, I guess around 1980s when I was in college, it really woke me up about when I was a young painter. And at that time, I remember reading in this catalog that these small paintings, which are kind of, they made me think of, I guess, nuts or pods or maybe fruity, like in a floating painting, but that he made boxes for them, and that they had the kind of velvet quality or the preciousness of the object because of that. And I was curious what you guys thought about that at the beginning, which I thought was very different from what goes into the paintings now to some extent, but I think it's also the genesis of a lot of what's in the work too.
Thank you. I didn't know that. You know that boxes
No,
was making it.
no, I don't know about this. Yeah. Tammy?
Thank you for sharing this story.
What was your question again?
About
Just
Commenting.
yeah.
Oh, please repeat. Yeah.
Can you repeat?
Just what you thought about that, the idea of treating those paintings as objects, as votive objects, kind of protecting them, but making them also hidden at times. I bet he's still here.
No.
It's not, okay. Just how that related to the later work, which I think of as being very different and actually, also impresses me in terms of the way I think of painting now in my life. But I don't know, that kind of painting with this first one, those, I'm curious what you guys think about that, those very, but paintings I'm talking about, they're pretty small.
Yeah, the early ones, yeah.
Based on shapes, kind of, some football shapes and.
The early painting that when you were shown at Washburn Gallery.
Yeah, that era.
Yeah, those were nasty paintings.
They were.
Well, they were very fierce, awkward, incredibly enigmatic. They're not easy paintings. They're not made by a painter with great eloquence. I think it's opposite now. I mean, he's painting for how many years now? So he can let go a little bit. The gesture became more confident. In the beginning, it was very compact. It's very dense. It's almost, there's no air. Like Ryder, it's packed.
But they're also illusionistic.
And they're
He's using, he creates an illusionary space and has these objects within these weird, almost symbolic objects that could be something you find in the woods or some metaphysical symbol. But I think that's one of the big changes is that at some point he leaves behind that. He loses interest in creating illusionistic space or doing using what Greenberg called homeless representation, using representational techniques in abstract painting. And I think that I would love to see a big retrospective of Bill's work so we could actually
can see that projection.
Yeah, it was nice to see it was shown Anton Karen,
Oh, yeah, that wall that had four paintings represent 4 decades. Absolutely, that was a great wall. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Can you, thanks for this. This is great. In what you're saying about, referring to Jensen in relation to early modern American modernism, and the question of how is he American or how is he influential contemporary? Can you maybe also contextualize him in relationship to other 80, postmodern painters, and not just mentioning high times, hard times, where it's really, that show's really about, when the white males leave painting behind for conceptual minimalism.
There was Jack Whitton in there.
Right. Men of color, women of color, and women in general pick up, are still carriers of painting. But in the 80s, there's a whole cohort with Jensen who kind of returned to the picture, Lasker, Gregory Aminoff, where picture making, even in its sort of relationship to avex and abstraction, returns back. It's not a Greenbergian fusion of figure ground, that the figure is a space in which, the ground is a space in which the figure sort of can move in behind the picture plane. This is happening in a lot of painters, postmodern painters, and it's also a globalism that's happening in the world, where New York is a place where people from all over the world are coming and working, and it's not as Protestant or as maybe the 19th century idea of America is. So I think that if you could talk that he's sort of, Jensen's a part of that, right?
That was the exhibition show I mentioned that I curated in 2013 at Chime and Reed. I saw it very much as the sequel to High Times, Hard Times, the show that Katie Siegel had done about the 70s. And it's exactly, I'm thinking about there were 15 artists in the show, and Harry Stefan, for instance, the kind of work he was doing at the time had a lot of similarities. Terry Winters as well. Seems like a stretch with Carol Dunn too.
Tom Nagowski.
Tom Noskowski maybe more than anyone else. I think that, and again, like that, but it's that the unexpected, almost radical return to not just to
Mary Highland
figure ground, stretch canvases, but also to art history, historical references, and also that Italy, for instance, Italy was very important to Bill, but it was also important to another person in that show, Stanley Whitney. It was like that painting was like, instead of seeing painting as like kind of 0 degree, you're going to get rid of everything that happened before Warhol. That I think, and that like love of painting, but it became okay. It became acceptable to like the smell of turpentine could return to the studio.
I feel like we need to mention David Reed because the Katie show, it was a co-curated show.
That's
true. You should get credit.
Well, actually, David didn't want to be credited as a co-curator. Advisor, he advised Katie to do the show because Katie just barely came to New York, hadn't done her doctoral dissertation with Richard Schiff, and that's how they met. It was David, who absolutely right, who introduced Katie to anyone. And that was the beginning of Katie's career as a curator. And she took it seriously. And but trust me, she did ask him whether he wanted to be credited as a co-curator, and he did not accept. He said, just, use my name as an advisor. It's interesting. But absolutely crucial figure. David is a historian of that period for sure.
You touched upon it briefly, but the role that immigration played in particularly in Bill's oeuvre, where you mentioned, say, him coming into Manhattan, ingesting the influences of this port city of New York, then going back to the hermetic environment of the studio to practice. But how do you feel the different waves of immigration played on Bill's being an American? Because as much as he allowed influences to come in from the outside, he still remains at heart an American. And that's an interesting phenomenon, I think.
Well, the interest in, can I just say one sentence and I shut up? In Taoism, the idea of present and absent has to be treated as with equal importance. In fact, there was a famous letter, you can look at an iPhone. I love my iPhone. I never had it until the arrival of the Trump presidency. But you can Google it, the famous letter, 1851, that Hawthorne, Melville took a break before finished the last chapter in Moby Dick and wrote to Hawthorne a kind of apologetic letter, what prevented him to visit his friend. And he told the story that every day he had to work so hard to keep up with the land. Sowing, cropping, his potato field, the cornfield. You have to remember, these people only wrote at night. And they self-taught. They never went to university. So he used the term, my ruthless democracy. In other words, if he treated the fact that he said, my writing is more important than my forming, is finito, American liberal democracy. It's so profound. And he even at some point railed against another term that I admire, which is the counter-friction against the hypocrisy of the brain. He railed against it. So that to me is an equal distribution of hand labor that equal the mind. You don't put the mind above, which is where we are in trouble right now. Vocational practice is considered to be inferior than intellectual practice. So I think Bill had that incredible, profound sense of balance. To me, it's somewhere between the image of Christ on the cross being exposed, incredible physical, sensual, you can even say erotic, you know? Incredible present, no? But Buddha under the Bodhi tree trying to attain nirvana, not being there at all. He's not there. So that's what Bill's painting is about. Trying to be as present as possible, but also attain the similar, achievable, a same sense of absent, not being there whatsoever. Look at that one, you know? Some of these kind of reveal that. And that's how I think more and more now. But he earned it. It took so long until now he can freely express himself at an older age now, you know? It's what we call heart-won unity. Heart-won unity. That's what I think about Bill and all the artists that we know, different degree, different, you know, Lauren Monk, you know, here's a good example. What kind of distribution of labor on the bike and all the video he had, you know, undertaken all these years in order to fit his own work in the studio. That to me, that is my ruthless democracy. And I can put that in the same context with Bill.
Thank you. Maybe we could.
Can I have a question? One more question, simple question. At the beginning of this, we were talking about how important it is for an artist to somehow embody his time, to present his particular little time slot in history and make that important and sort of use that to reflect out what his experiences were. In a case like Bill's, he spends so much time and over such a long time, and he's really referencing a lot of art history and the abstract expressionists and all of these various kinds of, we're talking about alchemical techniques and things like this, which is like extending over a very long period of time. So my question is it possible for someone to present the important and shocking things of their particular time, but somehow be able to compress, I don't know what, Bill's 50 or 60 or 70 years of painting and all the history that he references. So it seems like there'd be some kind of a dichotomy in that you're stuck in a little moment of time, but you're trying to reference all of this larger thing, you know. And has Bill done that? Is that what he's trying to do? Is that important, the moment in time, or is it the long time?
Well, I guess I would respond is that his strategy to reference this moment in time? I mean, it seems to me that these paintings are more about an outpouring of his subjectivity and his inner life rather than the ingredients of this particular culture. And maybe there are links between that. I mean, it's only for the future to determine, I think.
Thank you.
What? One more?
Okay.
It seems to me that to the exclusion of almost everything else, his primary interest is in craftsmanship and materiality. Would you care to comment on?
I think you should write the next catalog essay. No, there's no comment on this really. I think it's a painter's alchemy.
Excuse me?
It's a painter alchemy.
Yeah, that's why I said it, because he used the word alchemy.
Yeah, you can't really describe that, you know, really. You can describe the movement, the speed, the slowness, what we call speed of execution. It's very different painting, different throughout different stages of his life. I think that is something else, but I don't know. It's a mystery to me to look at the Bakunin Shonao Gagosian. I'm not so sure how I feel about the curation, but the way in which rhythm, in which imagery, painted imagery, being made with different speed, different condition. That's another thing that I would answer right now, is that you have to remember when Pollock moved to New York City, there's so many art historical interpretations, always referencing his work as where he came from, the Midwest, Cody, Wyoming, when it's vast landscape, horizontality. It came to the point where he came to New York. It's only when he moved to the Spring, Long Island. Pollock died in 1954? 56. Okay, so that's when he began to identify, as I say, his reference to Brighter and of course Melville is the Atlantic Ocean that contained that vastness. So my point is that the vastness is different kind of air, the same way that Bakunin discovered the Atlantic Ocean that meant so much in his own work, the late work particularly. So I don't know. I think that for Bill, he doesn't think like that. I think that turtleneck is still in him, you know, in Minnesota, that little lake. But the painterly gesture is so varied, it's hard to describe. I don't know how to describe it.
I'm just thinking about something, looking at these two paintings, with that vertical red line that Bill in the video which you made of him, he talks about that. And to make this vertical red line, he took a piece of wood and put paint on one side of the wood and just pressed it and printed it onto the canvas. And then he talks about how when he's in Italy, walking in the woods, the two things you have to worry about in Italy are vipers, poisonous vipers, and cinghiali, the wild boars. Mm-hmm. And so you take a big stick with you when you walk in, and you pound the earth to let the Vipers know that you're coming. And so Bill's talking about that. So then, like, so is this a, you know, self-portrait? It's hard to see it any other way.
It's funny you mentioned it because he said like with a stick I feel wiser.
Yes.
So which is also very, I don't know, there's this power of the stick also.
Yeah. But these are also, they look like fertility figures as well.
Yeah, but is that, are these stamped? I mean, it seems like there's some indexical stuff going on.
I think
here,
that's
like-
the only
But no,
indexical
but I mean,
element.
these sort of strange forms almost look like they're coming off of like a print thing, that there's an echo or a ghost
He does
of these moments happening here, which is another kind of printing.
Oh, I thought that was Michelangelo's self-portrait.
Right, is that the Michelangelo skin in the Last
That's what it looks
Judgment?
like to me.
Is it? And these are very Johnsy things.
Yeah.
So that's another thing.
I don't think
It's,
so.
it's,
No, I think these
Huh.
are all just.
Yeah.
it's how do you describe his interest in Michelangelo compact of the figures in the Last Judgment, which is monumental,
Yeah.
and his deep interest in Sienese painting, which is super small.
Yeah.
So that's another way of connecting to Italy too.
But I also think there's the, you know, Michelangelo's dematerialization in the last pieces, where all of that form is becoming almost pictorial and dissolving.
Yeah.
You know, is part of his
Disappearing
is part of his own cycle.
Yeah.
Right.
Non-finito.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. That's super true. Okay.
Shall we go to drinks and informal conversation?
I think so.